So yeah, welcome to the first Ori community call. Sorry for the little delay there. We had to figure out some technical issues, and I hope everyone can hear and see us now clearly. And we are here to discuss a little bit what happened since our last community event, the Ori Summit, in the last October, and see what new developments we have in Ori and what is coming in the future. So I will do a small introduction. My name is Vincent. I'm in charge of the Ori open source community to help developers have a better experience with using Ori open source and overall just growing our open source mission. I have with me on the call Eneas Reckers, who is the CTO of Ori and the mastermind behind Hydra and also big parts of Kratos. And I also have on the call Patrick Neu, who is our core maintainer of Oricloud, and he will tell us a little bit about Oricloud later on. So for the beginning, I want to start with what has happened in the last, it has almost been 6 months since we had the Ori Summit. And I don't think I'm exaggerating if I say there's been a huge number of changes and updates to Ori open source and also Oricloud. So maybe we start with Ori open source a little bit. So Eneas, I think you're the person who is most in tune with what's happening in Ori ecosystem at any given point in time, because you're relentlessly scouring GitHub for open pull requests and issues and so on. So what, from your point of view, what would be the change that you felt most excited about in Ori open source now in the last months?
Thank you, Vincent. So it's pretty tough to keep up, to be honest. There's so many pull requests coming in and questions on Slack, on GitHub issues, GitHub discussions, GitHub pull requests, and it's very difficult to keep up with all the changes that are coming in. And I guess that's probably the change that I'm most excited about, because we see just so many people, companies, hackers, people who want to try out stuff, people who run stuff in production, contribute, ask questions. And I think it's just mind-blowing how fast the community is basically growing. So I think from just a organizational standpoint, that's really a really exciting change, although it's of course not a change, but more like an evolution. But for sure. And I think there have been some really nice and really cool and high impact changes from the community also. So within Ori, we have focused mostly on a couple of topics. Primarily, we still, like Kratos is still, it still needs a few more features like SMS auth and passwordless login with Magic Link and some other things. We also are focusing the development, of course, to figure out how to bring Oricloud and the open source closer together. So we're working a lot on Keto, bringing Keto to the cloud, bringing Hydra to the cloud. And we have spent a lot of time on these topics. So it's really awesome to just see the many contributions that are coming into the projects where we currently don't have the resources to spend as much time on, and on features we don't have the resources to spend so much time on. And I think for Hydra, the most exciting change was the JSON Web Token profile. So we had support for the JSON Web Token profile already for client authentication last year, but we didn't have it for the general authorization grant. And there's still some follow-up pull requests coming in and also some bug fixes to improve this new profile that's now supported. And what's really great is that with these changes, it's now possible to use Hydra as like a token service or secure token service outside of the general OAuth2 flow, but rather basically using Hydra as a token generator, token validator, token manager, and using the JSON Web Token profile to basically bring all of these different tokens and authorization grants into Consort. And I think that's really cool. The second thing in Hydra that was really great is that we now have OpenID Connect dynamic client registration. We supported it before, but it was some work to get it to actually be public. And now we have a setting which you can just like enable or disable, and you'll be able to consume OIDC dynamic client registration and provide it out of the box. So you don't need to make any more changes. And I think that's also really nice because it just increases the amount of use cases where Ori Hydra can be used in. Regarding the ecosystem itself, we have made a couple of really big investments, I would say. In particular, we have completely moved away from Circle CI and Travis CI onto GitHub Actions. And even though GitHub has had a few issues in the past few weeks with Actions and MySQL 1, which is probably becoming a meme soon, it's a really big change because the average time it takes to run pull request checks, CI/CD checks, has been cut significantly. We have a much higher parallelism when it comes to executing the jobs, and also the release pipeline is, I think, much nicer. So one of the issues with that, with Circle CI before, was that some of our jobs take quite a lot of time because we built so many different binaries for so many different operating systems. For example, we added FreeBSD, I think maybe 2 or 3 months ago. And just building all of these binaries takes a lot of time. And with Circle CI, the maximum time a job can run is 1 hour. And for many of the basically open source that we are building, the time took longer than an hour. So we couldn't really release anything anymore. It was really, really flaky. So moving everything to GitHub Actions was a pretty big move. And we still have some repositories that don't use GitHub Actions yet. But we'll slowly migrate them over. It was really important for basically the big projects, so Hydra, Keto, Aufgeber, Kratos, to move them over. And talking about build and binaries, we have added support for Apple's M1 architecture a while back. So all of the Docker images, all of the binaries, it all runs on Apple M1. Of course, all other ARM systems as well. So if you use Linux, ARM, like Raspberry Pi, if you use Windows, ARM, which is, I think, not that common, but still like use cases exist, you can just download the binary and you don't have to do any compilation. This was a really complex change because we use SQLite, which requires CGO. And the problem with C is cross-compilation. So we need to cross-compile for Windows, Linux, Mac, different architectures, all from one basically operating system. So it's quite challenging to get it all done. But of course, open source and Linux provide all of the tools. So it's possible. It's just the fiddling that takes a lot of time. Apart from that, we've also invested time and effort to secure the supply chain. So supply chain management in software is very critical, as we've seen with SolarWinds and some other high-profile hacks and attacks. And we spent a lot of time to get all of the CVE reporting right, to generate SBOM definition files, but that you can just import into your I think it's called Black Duck systems or enterprise systems, to understand, okay, is this software secure? Does it use any CVEs? If it does, does it have an impact? Is it actually a CVE, or is it maybe just, a test library, for example, that doesn't really matter. And And yeah, like all the tooling uses it now. Also, we are signing all of the artifacts that we are releasing now with cosign. So you can rest assured that if you consume something and you download it from GitHub, you have a signature. The signature is can be validated with a like public known key. That's also on GitHub, so it's hard to fake. And you can be sure that the date or the binary that you're consuming is actually the binary that's coming from the source code that you see on GitHub for the specific git hash version that that you are looking at, basically. Another big change is that we have moved the documentation. So before we had documentation for all the different projects like Kratos, Keto, we had them all in the repositories. But we've moved everything into one repository because it was sometimes very difficult for new contributors to figure out where does this belong, where do I find the documentation, how do I run it. It was also difficult from an infrastructure perspective because we had to synchronize a lot of files across many different repositories. So we've moved all of the documentation into, into one repository. Maybe like one downside that I would also be interested to hear from the community on Slack would be we had to deprecate the versioning that we were using in the documentation before. We still plan to provide versioned docs for the configuration reference and the API reference, but most likely not for the other parts. We've done some like polls and stuff in the community prior to this change, and I think generally the like people accepted the change and it wasn't a big deal except for these like two documents. But yeah, I mean, we're still interested to see, hey, is there anything we can improve in terms of the documentation? Is it really important to have documentation that's maybe a year old, or is it okay if it's just like always up to date, basically? Yeah, we've done this change because it's just so much easier to manage and maintain and also to contribute to it, because otherwise you have like 6 different documents that all have the same content and you really need to figure out like where do I need to make my change. In Kratos, we have had some major developments as well. I think one of the most requested features is now available. It's importing users. So you can now import users and their credentials. And I think what's really cool is compared to other systems that are in the market, you can import any type of credentials. So you can even import YubiKey credentials, you can import social signing credentials, you can import TOTP credentials. And it's not just, you can import a password, but really you can migrate to Ori regardless of what authentication mechanisms you've used in the past. Of course, you might need to, prepare the data so that it's compatible with Ori's data model prior, but if it is compatible, then it's pretty straightforward to use. Also, we've introduced passwordless flows in Kratos, in particular passwordless with WebAuthn. Personally, I'm a big fan of WebAuthn. I have a new YubiKey with a touch thingy, so it needs to recognize my fingerprint for even more security. And WebAuthn is just a great way to protect against any phishing attacks, because WebAuthn doesn't work if the domain is not the domain that the WebAuthn key is expecting. So if you click on a spam email with like a phishing link, the key will not recognize the domain and it just won't work. So it's a very, very secure mechanism, which is why it's also the first one that we've introduced. But of course, we also want to still in the future support like Magic Link and SMS passwordless flows. And in the spirit of that, we've also added MFA with all the common like multi authentication factors. So hardware keys, Touch ID, Face ID, TOTP, which is like Google Authenticator, and backup recovery codes. So those are the codes you download on a text file as like a last resort if you lose your keys, if your phone gets reset. Otherwise, I think Kratos just has a constant stream of innovation and really amazing pull requests. So there's a pull request for adding SMS, for example, SMS flows. There's pull requests for adding search. There's pull requests for changing the like recovery and verification flows so that they become easier to manage in enterprise systems that use heavily use Outlook, for example. So there's many more things to come, and it's just amazing to see that so many like contributions. In Oathkeeper, we also had some changes. There's an ongoing effort, for example, to bring Oathkeeper to the newest lines of tooling that we use within Ori from a community member. We also added Trafic support in Oathkeeper so that you can combine Oathkeeper with Trafic. Of course, Oathkeeper already works with like Kong and some other systems, and I believe even Envoy is supported. And I think there's also much more that we want to do with Oathkeeper in the future, but maybe we'll touch on these topics a little bit later. Last but not least, in the ecosystem too, I think we've done a couple of changes which might be exciting on like when you actually work on them. They're not as big of as a change if you don't know about them. But for example, one such thing was that we reduced the startup time by, I think, almost 10 times. So we were using a library that was really deeply embedded in some like dependency tree. And that caused the whole system, like when you run, for example, Kratos serve, just took like, I think, 5 or 6 seconds to just boot the service, boot the binary. So we reduced that. So now the binary just starts like immediately. And I think this will also help if you are in really highly critical systems in production and you need to do like rolling releases or something like that. If the service doesn't need 5 minutes, doesn't need 10 seconds, just like, and it's live, that really helps with operations and building robust and reliable systems at scale. And then I think probably the biggest change recently has been that we have brought full compatibility between Oricloud and the Ori open source configuration and data formats and APIs. So the first project that we've touched here was Kratos. And with Kratos, it's now the SDK that you use in Oricloud, you can also use for Kratos and vice versa. The configuration that you use in Kratos, you can use in Oricloud, and you can also export the Oricloud configuration to use in Kratos self-hosted, which is, I think, a really cool change because you can sort of marry what we have in the cloud with the nice UIs and stuff. You can combine that with the open source version running in your Docker environment, running on your Kubernetes. And talking about Kubernetes, I think we have seen a lot of uptake in just the Helm charts as we use them now in our own SRE tooling, of course. And we also have a team that supports and maintains the Kubernetes Helm charts so that they just work out of the box for almost all of the use cases and that all of the bugs get fixed within a couple of hours usually of reporting them. So I guess that's the high level, a little bit unstructured overview of all the changes that we've made. It's of course always very difficult to catch everything because we have so many repositories, I think 200-ish that are open source. And we have cool projects like Docker Test, Herodot, Graceful, Go ACC that also get contributions and everything. But talking about every change would probably, we wouldn't be done with a community call until tomorrow. So I'm not sure, Patrick, who is working on Keto most of the time, maybe has some things to share of the big changes that we've made. I think we've made some changes to the database system and overall trying to improve the scalability and the robustness of the system. And yeah, maybe you have a few words of how that's going and where we are and what has been finished and what has changed over the past 6 months.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Basically, with your mentioned database restructuring, that happened already. Not sure when, but it's definitely some months back now. But we are now in a state where we could observe some data and some real world implications of this, and it really did speed up the overall performance of Keto, not to mention reduced the configuration and management overhead by quite a lot. So that was really a successful change, I'd say. Other than that, we have also observed, like we had now quite some time to observe all of the usage and use cases of Keto, as well as measuring some performance in basically real world scenarios. Because if you construct test data, you can really construct them well and then it's super fast, or you can construct them really bad and then it's super slow. So it's hard to tell how performant it actually is. It's kind of impossible to just write a generic benchmark test that is somehow gives you a reliable result. And we have observed basically, as we expected, that there are some parts that we can improve on the performance side. And we already identified some first steps to take, especially, I'm not sure who is familiar with the Zanzibar paper in depth, but there is also one very big feature of Zanzibar that Keto is based on. And that feature is basically some cluster mode where you have multiple instances of Keto running and communicating between each other while serving requests. And this is one potential potentially very big change and feature that can improve performance pretty well. And we didn't even touch this yet, and we can still optimize already the single node mode that we're using. And that's we're reaching very good performance with that already, and it's promising to see, and it's also, I think, a good starting point. But we'll have we'll work also on stuff like the cluster mode soonish. We'll first figure out some of the easy to get performance improvements, and then we'll be on to some bigger changes later on. And what's also very nice with Keto in general is we tested the APIs basically from the beginning, because we somehow were tightly inspired by the Zanzibar paper, and we're not sure if it's the best way to do the APIs, but in general, we're very happy how that turned out. And we're like with the gRPC APIs, we basically had no breaking change since the beginning. There is currently one change on master that's just renaming to get a more better naming of all the stuff, but in the the core, all the functionality didn't change at all in gRPC. With REST, we had a bit more hiccups, basically just because of some serialization bugs that we had, and then we decided to rename some keys and stuff. But also, that's just more of a naming thing. It's not really a structural change. We also identified some new APIs that will be coming very soon. One is, for example, a count API. Basically the same as list, it just, instead of getting you the whole list, returns only the count, which is going to be more performant. It might later on in a cluster mode fall back to just returning true or false whether anything can be found, which is the feature request that we actually had. So we basically identified the need to not see if basically use case would be, for example, should I display a list of objects in the user interface, or should I fall back to a case where you have something like create your first object or upload your first file or something like that? And you would use, of course, Keto to figure out what objects the user has access to, and if there is no objects, then you would fall back to different UI behavior. And that's basically the API that we will be adding very soon. We'll also add some more database layer improvements very soon. One is already partially implemented, but still awaits, needs some more engineering time and focus, but will also work, like definitely improve the performance in the long term.
Nice. And I think maybe one exciting change, not to the code base, is we are also adding new people to the project. So I think in a month or two, there's another engineer joining the Ori Keto team, working on figuring out how to do like all of the RBAC stuff and basically bringing Keto to not just an ACL, like a scalable ACL, but something that can also work with logic. And then, of course, Zookeys and all of the things that are still in store. And yeah, it's really cool to see also the team grow around the project.
And while we are on the subject of Oricloud, so one thing that we offer now is the Oricloud managed service that takes our open source services and basically lets you consume the APIs through a managed interface. We don't have to deal with Kubernetes and networking and all that. And one of the projects we add in the coming months is Oricloud. And can you tell me a bit about, or can you tell the community a bit about what they can expect from Oricloud in the cloud in those next months, maybe?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I'm happy to say that basically it works on my machine. But the problem is there are still quite a lot of tests that are failing. So especially because currently we only have Kratos in the cloud. Some parts of our code base are oriented to just support a single service, and there were some substantial changes needed to support 2 types of servers and 2 types of configs. And yeah, all of this is not critical, but essentially just takes a bit more time in testing to get everything right. But the Keto only part is basically working already and can be shipped probably very soon. Once Keto is available, it will offer the same capabilities as the open source Keto, minus the managing overhead that you will have to spin up instances, get a database up and running, apply migrations, update your software. So the API will be available. From the start, we'll support REST only, as we still have to figure out how to pipe gRPC through Authkeeper, basically. But once that's figured out, we can have gRPC APIs very soon as well. So that's the status of that.
And will subject set rewrites be a part of this then already, or is that planned for later stage?
That's currently not in the scope. We'll first get the current state up, and then it will be added later on. So, but that feature first, of course, has to be implemented in the open source to then be available.
But maybe I can say that we are already doing different types of research to figure out also what type of definition language we want to use, because I think one desire we have for user set rewrites is we don't want to define another DDL, another definition language that's specific to Ori that you have to learn and like do an academy and stuff, but instead use something, for example, from Google languages or some other definition languages that can provide the same type of flexibility, But of course, with technology, there's always trade-offs. So we have to figure out what exactly will work the best, and also what's the most scalable. But we're already doing the research, and I guess doing the research is already half the work to get it done, and the rest of the half work is writing the tests. But yeah, we're on track. It just takes time to come up with a really good, scalable, understandable model. Yeah.
Makes sense, yeah. So we talked about Oricito coming to the managed service Oricloud, and what other things can we expect in the next months? Is there anything else planned aside from Oricito, or what are you most excited about even working on or coming to Oricloud?
I think the probably most exciting thing in the near future will be Ori Hydra, available in Oricloud. And maybe like I want to give a little bit of just an idea, because like doing open source and doing cloud services is always like, okay, like which direction do you go? And I think for us, it's important that the open source is part of Oricloud, and basically we want to have full compatibility between the two. That means API compatibility, data compatibility, and configuration compatibility. And we have spent quite a lot of time over the past 4 to 5 months to get the configuration compatibility done and the API compatibility, which is also why Patrick mentioned that we have done some changes to the Keto APIs. And what's really cool is that we have now the Ori CLI, which, for example, allows you to export a config from the Oricloud user interface, where you can configure like social sign-in and everything, and basically export it to a YAML that Kratos understands. And also vice versa, you can import a config from the open source and into the Oricloud system, and then it's just running basically in Oricloud with all the like UIs and additional services that we're building around that. So while that's not a change that's upcoming, I think it's a change that I was personally really excited about, because it also allows you to relatively quickly get something from the documentation, for example, like how do you set up passwordless login, into just copy this command and run it in your like terminal window, and then it's like configured, and it works for both the cloud and for the open source. And so with the open source, I mean like in self-hosted Docker or Kubernetes or whatever you want to use. And I think that's really, really cool. And Vincent, I'm not sure, like, is it possible to do a little bit of a screen share to maybe just show?
Yeah, you can share your screen.
Okay.
No problem.
Okay. So maybe to just give you a feeling, I'll do a live demo of the system, and just to get started here. So I have the CLI installed locally. You can use brew install Ori tab CLI to install it on a Mac. We also have bash curl. We have scoop for Windows. So it's basically can be delivered in any way you want to have it, or just download it as a binary or compile it yourself. And once you have it installed, you have a variety of different commands you can use, which you can find using Ori help or also in the documentation. And you might already see that we have new commands such as patch, list, tunnel, get, create, and auth. And I just don't want to dive too deep into it. I think we have a lot of documentation to cover, and I also want to spend some time to answer the questions. But I just want to give you a sense of how this works and looks like. So when you get started with Ori in the cloud or the managed service, you can set up an account just using the CLI. Like you don't need to pay anything. It's just for developers basically. So you can sign up without using any web browser, just using the CLI. And of course, in the background, we do use Oricato's APIs to achieve that. And once you're logged in, you can do things like create a new Ori project, which then contains, the functionality that, for example, Katos has, and soon also Keto has, to create a new project or like tenant or workspace that's running the Oricloud project for you. And what's even cooler, I think, is you can get the config of the system, of the Katos config, as a YAML file. So if we do Ori get Katos config, and we use the ID of the project we just created, and we format it as YAML, it gives us the config that you might already know from the YAML files that we've seen in the configuration reference. And it's basically all of the, it's basically what you need to run Katos. So you can copy paste that into your local machine and run it within the Docker Compose example to set it up. And you can configure passwordless and whatever. And it just works here. And what's also really cool is with the commands like patch and put and update, it's possible to relatively easy, for example, enable passwordless flows. So just to give you a short preview of that, we will patch the Kratos config of the project here, and I'll just copy paste something from my other terminal window. And here you can see that I can patch the config, so self-service methods, web often enabled, which would correlate to this key here. And if I hit enter, it will update the config in the system, and it will configure all of the WebAuthn configuration parameters and enable it. And then, of course, you can use that again to export it into a Kratos config. So you can, it's really easy now to just manage the configuration. I think that's really, really, really cool. And with that, I'll stop the presentation. I think we have a lot of resources already and upcoming that also explain how all of this works in depth and in detail. Right.
Yeah, awesome. We shouldn't tempt the demo gods too much also. So that's we covered now most of the changes to Ori open source and also to the upcoming changes to Oricloud for the next few months, and also talked a little bit about Oriketo and what's coming there. So we also have our CEO Thomas Curran on the line. So sorry for not introducing you. But maybe you can tell us a bit about the vision for Ori, or where's the journey going in the next months from what can we tell our community there?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much, Vincent. I think what I'm really impressed about is the size and scope of the community and how it's growing in the last year, especially with your help, and all the stuff that we just saw is basically a product of thinking with a large community and creating things together. So this is a ton of work, but also a ton of fun. Well, not always fun, but it's interesting, at least to say at least interesting. So where's Ori going? So we had a pretty big year in 2021, Ori as a community, but also Ori as a company. And of course, for any of you that have seen the website and the cloud product, we're growing as a business alongside of the also open source community work we're doing. One thing that has gotten better, I think, in 2021 is our overall commitment to open source. We believe that this is a fundamental change in the way software companies are being built, not just software. And Ori is lucky to be part of that change. I think the success of other open source companies has led us to be a little bit bolder about how we view the commercial opportunities to work with customers that wish to engage mostly on our cloud platform. And why is that? It's because we put a lot of time and effort into thinking about how we would use the components of Ori open source along with other great open source projects, and manufacture a new type of software platform that delivers on a number of goals. One is to be a global specialized platform as a service that integrates identity, access control, authentication, authorization into one unified network infrastructure that is highly distributed, low latency, and extremely secure. We see that there is not only a big driver around the work that Patrick mentioned, of course, all the things that are going on with authorization, but identity management has also now been able to grow together with these other two areas. And it's becoming clear to us that this is a major challenge for companies around the globe that need to protect the interactions they have with external parties, especially humans, consumers, but also external devices and other interactions that may happen across networks, including, of course, everything related to crypto, the whole IoT, and all of the devices that are happening. And we see that authorization needs to be combined with distribution and low latency in order to make it a safer world for everyone. So one is that's a big thing that we're working on as a team, and that's our main commercial focus. Of course, funding gives us also a great opportunity to spend more on the open source community, and also as a company, we plan on opening the Ori Academy at sometime soon. I know we talked about this last year. We're making progress. We're also making progress on physical facilities that will give us a way to invite developers from around the world to Germany to help us and work with us. And also, of course, the big benefit of collaboration is learning and understanding how open source works and working together with the team. We'll also have a more modernized on-site computer facility that will help, especially understanding computer security topics such as encryption, also looking at some of the dimensions and scale of various encryption algorithms alongside of physical facility protection, also looking at the cloud and cloud advances in distribution, such as Antos from Google. And we expect that to be a big contribution, as well as an interesting technical diversion for some people in the company. So we're pretty happy about that. Then we also see another emerging area that we feel we need to embrace as an open source effort. This is really, I would just broadly call it integration, and integration with other open source products, starting with Keycloak, I think, as an example, where we see a big community of developers that also are beginning to ask these questions, how to build more collaborative zero trust security infrastructures. And integration with those products, of course, is helped by the fact that Ori is committed to open standards, and building on open standards, of course, helps in the end with interoperability. But we also see a lot of developers asking us about legacy products like Auth0 that are now being that people are changing in order to move to more modern infrastructure such as Ori. And when that happens, of course, there's a lot of information that companies want to keep and take along. So that type of integration or migration as an open source project, I think, is going to be on our list. We also see integration opportunities for a number of other business platforms such as WordPress, Salesforce, Stripe, MailChimp. We have quite a large, I think, community of developers now that are looking at Ori as an application development platform, not just identity management and authorization. And some of the best practices that we're following around GitOps, and especially building and testing our network infrastructure, we want to be able to share with developers as well. So on a number of areas, we think there's opportunities to integrate. Maybe last but not least, we've been making a lot of effort around the Envoy, Sidecar, Istio, and looking at some of the companies and other projects in that space. Needless to say, we're very happy that we were featured in the recent SoloCon as one of the leaders in the space, but we're also working with other good projects, TechRate as an example, and within the Istio community to assure that there's more security around the mesh networking infrastructures, and especially as you go from one network to another. And we believe that Ori, in combination with some other open source companies, can help create a more secure infrastructure there. There's been a lot of discussion on the community about documentation and learning materials. As I mentioned in the academy, that's big, but one thing that we've been able to do, I think, within the scope of our recent funding was bring on people that are dedicated to helping explain how to work with Ori and how Ori works. And besides the beef up in the community itself, we're also now taking large strides in making documentation better and easier to use. And of course, we see documentation in a way that we see many other things, which is the creation process should be as automated as possible. And we're also open sourcing a lot of the ideas around how to make that documentation pipeline as automated and as tooled in the degree as possible. So both of those things, in other words, the content itself and the creation concepts, should help us, I think, and the community grow into a better source of information. Some of the things Aeneas just showed also would, the last point, that we're really making a large effort to complete our goal of removing Docker from our entire infrastructure. This is not anything, there's nothing wrong with Docker in a sense, but we have seen that the configuration and a lot of the static information required to get Docker working together with some of the Ori projects has caused a lot of headaches. And since we're at about 50 million Docker pulls last time I looked, this is quite a big effort for us to be. So what we're doing instead is giving everyone the chance of having an Oricloud account, using it the same way you would have used Docker, but giving us and you a chance also to work on an improved and specialized platform as a service, where you have also the information and the data specialized for the type of application infrastructure that we think developers worldwide would use. Of course, there's always upgrade opportunities if people would like to benefit from one of the leading cloud infrastructures for this zero trust security. We're happy to sign you up. But again, as a member of the open source community at Ori, we aim and aspire to provide the largest possible resource and infrastructure to talented developers and participants in the community worldwide. So that's a little bit of our update. You know, we haven't stopped growing and we haven't stopped raising money, and we won't stop until we think the world is a much better place with Ori in as many places of the world as possible.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, that was a great summary, I would say. Yeah, we do have two questions from our listeners now. So one would be from Timothy. He's asking that now that we have implemented features like importing users and aligned the configurations between Ori open source and Oricloud, how feasible would it be to move from self-hosted Ori to Oricloud? Maybe Aeneas, you can maybe answer that best, I think.
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely feasible. We probably would need someone from our side to just assist a little bit with the flow to ensure that there's like not too much the frustration when we try it. We haven't figured out every little detail, so it depends a little bit on what the goal of the migration is. If it is, for example, migrating a large-scale system that's already running in production, then of course the migration is a little bit more difficult. If it's more about migrating a smaller system, I think it's absolutely feasible. And I guess in the future, we also want to figure out how we can actually import full database dumps from the open source into the cloud system. But this, of course, has a lot of like security implications and risk. So it needs to be engineered very carefully. But it should for sure be possible to do it today. And maybe Andrew or Vincent can pick it up with Timothy, figure out what do we need, what's the goal, what are the requirements in the context. And then I think it should be good to go.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, exactly as Jens mentioned, feel free to reach out to me or my colleague Andrew. And we do have something in the works for migrating from other systems to Ori. And so we are just looking to get some feedback from what you need and what you expect there. And there was another question from Taylor. And he was asking, after experimenting with distributed tracing in a subsection of our systems, we plan to add open tracing support. Are there any plans to support this with Ori at the moment?
So we do support open tracing. And sometimes I get confused because there's open telemetry, open sensors, and open tracing. So it's 3 projects. And I believe open telemetry, if I'm not mistaken, is the one which is the one basically now. It's a merge of open sensors and open tracing. And we're now doing an effort to migrate the open tracing providers that we have at the moment to open telemetry, as that provides much more integration with different tools. It also provides more data and insights. And another change that we're doing is, since we run SRE, of course, at Ori for Oricloud. So we heavily rely on monitoring to monitor our SLIs and SLOs. We require tracing to figure out, okay, why is a request slow, for example, why did it fail? And for these reasons, we're actually putting also time and effort into improving the telemetry and the tracing that we have significantly, so that it's possible to trace basically everything from ingress to the system, to the database, back to the system, back to the egress. And I think we'll probably see in maybe a month or 2 a significant improvement in the tooling that we provide here. So yeah, open tracing is possible today, and open telemetry will be possible soon.
Yeah, that sounds great. I hope that answers your question, Taylor. And I think we are through with the main bulk of the questions. If there's nothing coming in at the last seconds, I would say one last question from me personally to you would be, so you have worked in open source so long and built the whole Ori project and so on. And in your experience, what is the most effective way for people to participate really with development in the open source? Is it either creating issues or feedback or pull requests, doing reviews and so on? So what would be something where you recommend, hey, if you really want to make an impact, that's the best way to do it?
That's a really good question. I think there's a multitude of layers that you can address. I think the best way to get started is through the Slack community, because there you have peers and others that might have questions you could answer, or you might have questions that the peers can answer. And of course, everyone from the Ori team is monitoring the Slack, even though we're maybe not all answering to every question with all of the team. We try to be as responsive as possible. And that's for sure a good way to get into the Ori world, basically. Then for contributions, if you want to get started, we have a label which is called Good First Issue, or I believe it's Good First Issue, which you can use. And those are usually issues which don't require too much engineering work and are a little bit easier to tackle than maybe some of the larger scale changes. And those issues are usually a good idea to take a look at if you want to contribute to Ori open source. And if you do want to do something there, it's always a good idea to just ask in the issue, hey, this is a little bit the plan and the idea that I had, or maybe, hey, could you maybe point me to the file where I can find, the changes that I need to make. And that's usually the best way to get the pull request out, and also to have a pull request that's basically already like pre-cleared with maintainers. So it takes less time to merge it because there's less discussion in the pull request of like how to do things and where to add tests and stuff. So I would say first, start with the Slack community. And then second would be take a little bit of a look at the issues. And if you have something that you want to contribute that's not an issue, it's also always a good idea to just clear it. If it's a larger change, to just clear it with the maintainers of the respective projects, because then it's much more likely to be merged relatively quickly. It's security software, and it always requires very, very difficult trade-offs that you have to make when designing the architecture and the code bases. So it's really important that everyone is on the same page when it comes to those changes. I hope this answers the question.
Yeah, that was a very good answer. So thanks for that. We had one last question from Dennis. He is asking if we have any infos on Ori Summit 2022, and actually we do. So we have been working on it in the background, and we are basically almost ready to release it. So we will release the call for papers in April, and get you more infos, and then you can sign up. The date will be the same as last year, so in late October. And we expect to have a lot of interesting use cases from the community. And this year is also in person in Munich. If you are in Bavaria or in the region, we are very happy for you to join us in person, and otherwise it's all streamed live as last year. So that's for the Ori Summit. You will soon hear more about this. And with that, I would say thank you all for joining, and thanks Aeneas and Thomas and Patrick for all your insight there, and thanks Alano for hosting everything in the background. You couldn't see him, but he made this stream possible. And see you in the next one soon. And please feel free to reach out to us in the Slack or on GitHub for feedback and everything else, of course.
Thank you very much, Vincent. And also thank you to Taylor, Timothy, Dennis for the questions. And we'll see you each and everyone on Slack.